Hey guys, welcome to the 3DO show. Oh wait, no, it's not the 3DO show. It's Retro Mag. And welcome once again, my friends. This is Retro Mag, and today we are looking at the 3DO. Now, 3DO, some call it the Panasonic 3DO. So what is it? Before we get into that, please, if you like this show, please click like. You can subscribe also if you haven't done so already. I'm looking to bring content on a regular basis, everything gaming, whether it's old, new, a lot of retro stuff on the go. So without further ado, let's get into the 3DO. Before I get started, just a quick shout out to Noble Society. Thank you for your comments, and be nice to see welcome all comments and subscriptions and likes and everything that goes with that. So 3DO was actually created in 1991 by a man called Trip Hawkins. Many of you probably won't have even heard of Trip Hawkins, but he was actually the man who created Electronic Arts. Of course, we know Electronic Arts these days as EA. EA Sports is the most famous part of this, with your FIFAs and Maddens and everything that goes with that. So yeah, he thought of the idea back in 1991, and back then CD technology was very new, but he was looking to sort of bring it along. We only had one speed CDs, of course Blu-rays nowadays, but by 1993 the first one had been created by Panasonic, and that's why a lot of people call it the Panasonic 3DO. Now you might ask yourself, of course, why Panasonic? Well, 3DO company, which was an actual company, it wasn't just the one man, it was a company called 3DO Company. They didn't have the manufacturing resources themselves, so what they did was they actually licensed the concept of the consoles themselves to third parties, so Panasonic being one. They also targeted Sony, but of course Sony had already started work on the PlayStation, so they weren't interested. But other companies such as Samsung, Toshiba, Goldstar, of course, these days is called LG, but back in the early 90s they were called Goldstar. AT&T also were another target, which of course is an American company. You don't see them over here, but Sanyo as well. So the idea was each of these different companies would make a 3DO, but all the games that were made by predominantly Electronic Arts, of course, would work on all consoles. So quite an expensive console to start with. So you're talking about $600, £600, because the manufacturing of the consoles was quite a lot. See, the expense of the consoles, that was quite a new concept, because previously with the Super Nintendos and the Super Famicoms, of course, and the Sega Genesis, Sega Mega Drive, Sega and Nintendo, they would make a loss on the consoles. They'd sell them a bit cheaper, make a loss, because they knew they'd make all their money from the games. Whereas the companies making a 3DO, they didn't make games, so they had to make a profit on the consoles, which is why the consoles were so expensive, and really they priced themselves out of the market straight from the get-go. So of all these manufacturers now on board making these consoles, sort of Panasonic starting it all off with the FZ1, of course, the seeds were sown. So this wasn't just going to be a games console that the previous generations had been, so your Mega Drives and your Super Nintendos. This was going to be a multimedia centre. This was going to play your films, this was going to play the games, this was going to play your music CDs. Trip Hawkins had planned it all, but of course as a result it set at a very high price. No longer did it slot into the TV aerial in the back. This operated on SCART, RGB, and Trip had planned for it to actually be HD as well. It was going to be HD TV capable as well, but it didn't actually quite get to that, and he did plan a sequel console which was started but never actually saw the light of day. So $600, a lot of money back then for a games console, and as a result didn't really sell a huge amount. But it did make a lot of good press. So it did make the cover of Forbes magazine, which was no mean feat, and it was basically recognising the advancement in technology compared with previous consoles and the potential there was. So this was a beast of a machine, and it opened up the launch of a lot of games that we see now. Unfortunately, it wasn't what you'd call a successful launch, and I'll go over some of the games a bit later on, but unfortunately there wasn't enough manufactured on time, so as a result stores didn't have them on launch day. They only had literally 1 or 2 units, and by mid-November of 1993, which is about 6 months into the launch, they'd only sold 30,000 units altogether. Japan was a little bit more successful because there was about 6 games lined up at launch. Japanese had sold 70,000 units by mid-94. Unfortunately, sales dropped, and by 1995, Japan were known more. There was no more in Japan for the adult content. Let's just say, unfortunately. So by mid-1995, they'd actually reduced the price about half. So it's about $300 by the middle of 1995. So as you can see, it dropped quite significantly. Wasn't doing very well, and they announced they were going to make a successor, which was going to be called the M2. Initially, it was just going to be an add-on, but they decided eventually it would be an M2, and it would be backwards compatible as well. But it didn't go anywhere, and they eventually cancelled it. By the end of 1995, Gold Star version, which of course had come out by this point, they dropped to $200. So it'd become quite cheap by the end of it, but it was too late. People had moved on. The PlayStation had been released. Everyone had moved over to the PlayStation that wasn't here, and it eventually died a death. So what consoles were there then? So I mentioned the Panasonic. So you had the Panasonic FZ1, which was a front-loading electronic tray device. As I say, a bit like the original first Xbox. Then you had the Panasonic FZ10, which was a cheaper to manufacture, more plasticky console. Actually did look very nice. Image of it up on your screen right about now. But it was top loading, so you press a button. It was not mechanical loading, it was spring loaded top loading. The Gold Star LG 3DO Interactive. This one was a front loader as well, similar to the FZ1. And you also had the Sanyo 3DO Tri, but I believe that one was really only, it was released in 1995, but it was only available in Japan. There were some other variations as well. So Korea had their own version of the 3DO, which is quite rare. I mean, if you've got your hands on one of them, they're worth a lot of money. And even for PC owners out there, there was also an expansion card that you could put in your PC at the time, so you could play the games on your PC. And then of course the arcades also had their own 3DO counterpart as well. So some of the laser shooting games, which I'll go over in a bit, were arcade ports. So what were the specs of this beast then? Well, by today's standard, very low, but at the time, you're talking 1993, you're talking nearly 30 years ago now. These were top of the range specs, so talking 32-bit CPU running at 12.5 megahertz, 2 megabytes of RAM. They did have internal memory as well, which was 32 kilobytes of internal storage for your save games and things like that. Of course, games didn't install like they do now, so it was purely just the save games really. Of course, I mentioned it was CD-ROM as well. I think it was only 1 or 2 speed CD-ROM back then, so nothing to compared with today's standard, but back then, of course, you couldn't really. I mean, they didn't have copy protection either, so technically you could play copy games. But back then, of course, you didn't have the technology to copy the games, to be able to play copy games. PCs were very expensive as well, and to buy blank discs, and of course CD writers. There was no such thing as DVD writers then. It was an expensive affair, so people didn't do it, so they didn't bother putting the copy protection on. So what about the games? After all, that's what we play these things for. So what games were on the 3DO? So I mentioned that 3DO started a lot of games that we saw today, mainly EA games, Electronic Arts. So FIFA, first ever 3D version of FIFA, was on the 3DO. The sequel to the mega hit Road Rash on the Mega Drive was on the 3DO, so it's the first 3D version of that. You had a game called Foes of Ali, which was a boxing simulator by EA, so that's what eventually became Fight Night on the later consoles. You also had Space Hulk, so the best version of Space Hulk, in my mind, was on the 3DO. That did land on the Sega Saturn. It also landed on the PlayStation 1. You had the first 3D version of John Madden. Didn't have licensed names from memory, but it was there. You also had such mega hits such as Super Street Fighter 2. The best version I feel of that was on the 3DO. Samurai Showdown, cracking version of that on here. You also had ports of Doom. Not a great port, that one, on the 3DO, but had some weird rock music. But also Wolfenstein as well. It was also famous, there was around early 90s, you also had a massive load of interactive movie, digital video games. So Sewer Shark, Night Trap, Corpse Killer, they all made their way onto the 3DO. Where B-list actors would act out the scenes and you just control their movements. Digital pictures was fundamental in these companies. Made a lot of them for the Mega CD, Sega CD prior to that. But you also had Demolition Man. It was the only version of Demolition Man that was done in this way, so it's all Stallone actually acting scenes out for it. So a very good version of that. Also had some notable games such as Out of This World and Flashback, which previously had been on the Sega Genesis and the Sega Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo. Added a bit of animation to these versions to spruce them up a bit for the CD era. PGA Golf, PGA Tour 96, sort of effectively the first 3D version of the PGA games as well. Games such as Primal Rage, Quarantine, classics such as Need for Speed, first 3D version effectively of Need for Speed, which again followed on with the PlayStation version and the Sega Saturn version, and games such as Shockwave. Not many RPGs on there, there's one or two, but it wasn't known for its RPGs at all. So if you were an RPG fan, you wouldn't have liked this system really. Some sports games such as the FIFAs, also Slam and Jam Basketball as well. Striker World Cup wasn't very good, that one. The Wing Commander games found their way onto the 3DO. So Wing Commander 3, starring of course Mark Hamill, and some arcade classics such as Who Shot Johnny Rock and Mad Dog McCree. Sort of with the light guns and the interactive movies at the time. And who can forget the weird game show called Twisted game show, where you and up to 4 players could answer questions, work your way up the game board, controlling real actors, if you like, to make their way to the top and win the game. So that's your 3DO. So a little brief history of 3DO. So basically 1993 it all kicked off. Didn't last very long. There are some bits and bobs out there for the 3DO. Of course, you can't buy anything new anymore, but eBay is a good resource for 3DO consoles if you did want to collect, and you can often get the games there. They're reasonably priced, so you're talking under $20 for most games. Some go for a little bit more than that. There's some quite rarities out there. They have lasted the test of time, as long as you play them on an old CRT TV, of course, and not on something modern. Don't look quite as good in HD. If you want some information, there is a ebook, a Kindle book on Amazon, which is titled 3DO: An Unofficial Brief History, 1993 to 2003. I'll put a link in the show notes, so that you can go and check that out. It's reasonably priced at £1.99 over on Amazon.co.uk. And that's it, folks. Thanks for listening. You can click like if you want to, and if you like the show, and of course don't forget to subscribe, and I will catch you next time.